Welcome to The Explainer. Okay, let's dive right into this. Today we're unpacking a highly complex series of events that profoundly shook the UK in the summer of 2024. We're going to examine the tragic catalyst, the incredibly rapid spread of misinformation, and the sheer massive scale of both the community and legal responses that followed.
So right off the bat, here's the central question we have to ask ourselves. How exactly did a local tragedy ignite a nationwide crisis? We are confronted with this stark contrast between a very physical, localized heartbreak and a digital powder keg that was just waiting for a spark. In a matter of days, the grief of a single community was weaponized online, and it spilled out into the streets of towns and cities all across England and Northern Ireland.
Here is our roadmap for making sense of all this chaos. 1. Tragedy and misinformation spark. 2. Escalation and targeted violence. 3. Organizing the unrest. 4. Communities pushback. And 5. The legal aftermath.
All right, let's move to our first section. Part 1. Tragedy and Misinformation Spark.
Our timeline starts on July 29, 2024. A horrific knife attack took place at a children's dance and yoga workshop in Southport, England. Tragically, 3 young girls were killed, and multiple other children and adults were critically injured. Now, this is our baseline reality. It was a devastating local crime that instantly captured the nation's grief. But almost immediately, and this is really where the story shifts, a parallel, completely fabricated narrative began to form online.
And this brilliantly illustrates the massive divide between the internet and reality. You had these viral rumors from high-profile social media accounts falsely claiming the suspect was an asylum seeker or a Muslim. They even went so far as to invent a fake name, Ali al-Shaqati. But the actual police-confirmed facts painted a completely different picture. The suspect was a 17-year-old British citizen. He was born in Cardiff to Rwandan parents, had lived in the area for years, and had absolutely zero known links to Islam.
We are looking at a textbook case of disinformation here. That's false information deliberately spread to obscure the truth. And what's truly wild is just how fast this moved. That fake identity was amplified on X, pushed by a fake news website called Channel 3 Now, and then rapidly accelerated in newly created Telegram groups. One specific Telegram group, titled Southport Wake Up, pulled in 14,000 members almost overnight. These digital platforms essentially operated as giant echo chambers, inciting anger and mobilizing people based on completely fabricated claims.
Which brings us to part 2, escalation and targeted violence. The way this unrest spread geographically was startlingly fast. It starts a single day after the tragedy. On July 30th, a riot breaks out right outside the Southport Mosque. The very next day, unrest hits London, Manchester, and Hartlepool. By the weekend of August 3rd and 4th, we see peak violence erupting in places like Rotherham, Liverpool, and Belfast. So this unrest moved swiftly from a localized riot to a full-blown nationwide crisis in just under a week, eventually culminating in mass counter-protests by August 7th.
Now, these crowds weren't just randomly gathering. They were directing their anger at very specific locations. Driven by the anti-immigration and Islamophobic sentiments that were circulating online, rioters targeted mosques and local citizens' advice bureaus. Shockingly, they even circulated lists of immigration law specialists online to target their specific offices. They also attacked multiple Holiday Inn hotels that were known to be housing asylum seekers, throwing bricks, smashing windows, and in some really terrifying cases, trying to set the buildings on fire while people were still inside.
And the sentiment out there? It was made crystal clear by the chants documented by authorities and journalists on the ground. Outside the Southport Mosque, crowds were shouting, "No surrender." Over in Sunderland and Manchester, the big rallying cry was, "We want our country back." These slogans are historically deeply associated with far-right groups in the UK, which really signaled the ideological driving force behind the crowds gathering in these cities.
Let's move to Section 3, Organizing the Unrest.
What's fascinating here is that the data shows these riots heavily lacked a traditional top-down formal organization. There was no single leader calling the shots. Instead, the mobilization was entirely decentralized. It was driven by far-right social media personalities and localized Telegram group chats, like that Southport Wake Up group we mentioned earlier. These digital networks allowed completely disparate individuals to coordinate times and locations instantly, without needing any kind of official organizational structure.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how cleanly we can categorize the specific factions documented during these clashes. On the far right side, you had supporters of the defunct English Defence League, members of the neo-Nazi group Patriotic Alternative, and networks like Active Club England.
But on the flip side, stepping in as counter-protesters, you had groups like Stand Up to Racism, completely unaffiliated local residents, and Muslim youth mobilizing to protect their own communities and places of worship.
Moving on to Part 4. Communities push back.
You can literally see a night and day difference in the methods used by these two groups. The riots were characterized by violent disorder, burning police vehicles, looting shops, throwing concrete blocks, and launching racist attacks. But the counter-protest methods were largely defensive and protective. We're talking about people linking arms to form human shields, holding massive peaceful rallies just to outnumber the rioters, and turning out the very next morning to sweep up the debris and rebuild damaged brickwork in their towns.
By August 7th, the sheer scale of this community pushback was just undeniable. In Liverpool, hundreds of residents formed a literal human shield outside a church operating as an asylum charity to protect it from potential attacks. In Brighton, the turnout was so heavily skewed that police actually had to surround and protect a tiny group of just 8 far-right protesters from a massive crowd of about 2,000 counter-protesters. And in Walthamstow, London, an estimated 10,000 people showed up for a peaceful counter-rally. Local communities essentially overwhelmed the unrest through sheer numbers.
Finally, Section 5. The legal aftermath. Let's ground ourselves with this number, 361. That is the absolute minimum number of police officers who were injured trying to contain the violence across the country. Officers suffered broken jaws, broken noses, and were attacked with bricks, fireworks, and even chairs. Police dogs and horses were also injured in the clashes, which really demonstrates the severe physical toll this week of unrest took on law enforcement.
And the authorities' response? It was swift, and honestly pretty unprecedented in recent history. Looking back from July 2025, we know that this historical event resulted in a staggering 1,840 total arrests. Law enforcement used facial recognition, social media footage, and CCTV to track down the individuals involved in the disorder, looting, and arson.
So the crucial point is this immense volume. 1,103 official charges. The justice system was so overwhelmingly flooded that the UK government had to actually activate Operation Early Dawn. This was an emergency measure put in place in the north of England and the Midlands just to manage severe prison overcrowding. They were literally holding defendants in police cells simply because the actual prisons were completely full.
For those who were charged, the judicial outcomes were definitely severe. Sentences for people involved in the widespread disorder averaged around 2 years, with some sentences ranging all the way up to 9 years for the most serious offenses. The courts basically finalized this entire timeline of cause, effect, and consequence with a very, very firm legal footprint.
Which wraps up our explainer today, but I want to leave you with a critical, lasting question to think about. What is the future impact of social media disinformation on real-world community cohesion? We've just seen exactly how quickly digital rumors can jump from a screen right into the streets, permanently altering physical communities. How we navigate this new reality is something we're all going to have to figure out together. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you in the next explainer.